The jazz club in the underbelly of Seoul was loud, but when Zara stepped up to the microphone, the room fell dead silent. She didn't smile. Her eyes were hard, carrying the weight of a betrayal that had left her broken and broke. She sang a melody so raw, so haunting, that in the VIP booth, Chairman Jace, a man who had never felt a spark of warmth in his life, froze. He didn't just hear her, his cold heart completely melted. But as Zara walked off the stage, she didn't look at the applause. She walked straight to the back room where her 8-year-old son Noah sat waiting. When the boy reached for her hand, Zara pulled away, her voice cold. "Don't lean on me, Noah. In this world you stand alone." Jace saw the interaction from the shadows, and his obsession shifted from just the woman to the broken family she was guarding. Welcome to Annie's empire of love, where power meets vulnerability, and the deepest wounds find the fiercest protectors. Today, you'll witness a mother who forgot how to love, and a mafia king who will tear down Seoul just to teach her how to smile again. This isn't just romance, it's healing, it's redemption. Make sure you're subscribed and hit that like button. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, so find your quiet place, dim the lights, and get ready. Because in Annie's empire, love is the only law worth breaking. Let's begin. The transition from the smoky stage of the Velvet Lounge to the clinical glass of the owner's office happened within 24 hours. Zara didn't even have time to wash the stage makeup from her eyes before the club manager handed her a brand new contract. The club had been bought out, lock, stock, and barrel. And the new owner had made one single non-negotiable demand. Zara was no longer a rotating act. She was his exclusive, private performer. When Zara walked into the office to meet her new employer, she expected a sleazy corporate mogul. Instead, she found Chairman Jace. He sat behind the heavy mahogany desk, a silhouette of absolute authority framed against the glittering Seoul skyline. He was breathtakingly handsome, with a razor-sharp jawline and dark, penetrating eyes that seemed to calculate the mathematical value of everything they landed on. He wore a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit that screamed old money and new power. To anyone else, he was the Iron Boss, a man whose nod could ruin a billion-dollar merger or vanish a rival syndicate overnight. To Zara, he just looked like another man with too much money and a dangerous appetite. Her past with her toxic, abusive ex-husband had given her a PhD in recognizing monsters who hid behind expensive smiles. Jace didn't smile. He simply watched her walk in, his eyes dropping to the plain, oversized black sweater and faded denim she had deliberately chosen to wear. He had sent a rack of haute couture silk gowns to her dressing room an hour prior. She hadn't touched a single one. "You didn't like the dresses?" Jace asked, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that sent an unwelcome shiver down Zara's spine. "I don't wear clothes I didn't buy myself, Chairman," Zara replied, her voice clipping the air with icy precision. She didn't bow, she stood perfectly straight, her long, elegant box braids hanging past her shoulders like armor. "And I don't like being bought out. I am a singer, not a corporate asset." Jace leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his long fingers. A subtle flash of fascination crossed his cold features. No one spoke to him this way. People trembled in his presence, they begged for his favor. Yet this beautiful, dark-skinned woman stood in his office looking at him like he was dirt on her shoe. "It wasn't a purchase, Zara. It was an investment," Jace said smoothly. He slid a pristine velvet box across the desk. The lid was open, revealing a flawless, brilliant cut diamond necklace that caught the ambient light. "Consider it a signing bonus, a token of my appreciation for your talent." Zara didn't even glance down at the diamonds. Instead, she stepped up to the desk, her expression tightening into a mask of pure defiance. With one swift, deliberate motion, she pushed the velvet box right back across the polished wood, letting it slide until it tapped against his hand. "Keep your tokens, Chairman." She spat, her dark eyes locking onto his with lethal intensity. "A man with blood on his hands has absolutely nothing that I want. You bought this club because you think your billions give you the right to own the things that catch your eye. But let me make something very clear to you. I have a contract to sing. I will sing my set. I will take my paycheck, and then I will leave. Do not send things to my dressing room. Do not look at me from your VIP booth like you're choosing a meal. You can buy the building, Jace, but you can't buy me." The room went completely breathless. Outside the glass door, Jace's personal security detail went rigid, their hands instinctively moving toward their jackets, shocked by the utter disrespect shown to their boss. One word from Jace, and she would be ruined. But Jace didn't call his guards. He looked down at the returned diamonds and then back up at Zara. For the first time in his entire life, the Iron Boss felt a genuine pounding rush of heat in his chest. Her rejection didn't anger him, it intoxicated him. Her fierce, unyielding pride was more dazzling than any jewel he had ever owned. She was entirely unbreakable, a queen standing in the middle of his empire, completely unafraid of his shadows. "The contract stands, Zara," Jace said softly, his eyes burning with a dark, awakening obsession. "You will sing your sets. But remember this. I am a patient man, and I have never lost a prize I set my mind on." "I am not a prize," Zara whispered, her voice trembling with a deep, defensive rage as she turned on her heel and marched out of the office, slamming the heavy glass door behind her. She walked fast down the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was furious, she was guarded, and most of all, she was terrified of the strange magnetic pull she had felt in that room. She hurried back toward the employee break room, her thoughts immediately snapping back to reality. She had to get Noah. She had to keep her walls up. Because if she let even a single crack form in her armor, men like Jace would tear her entire life apart. The Velvet Lounge transformed under Chairman Jace's ownership, but the shift was subtle, almost invisible to the naked eye. The rowdy corporate crowds and the loud, wealthy tourists vanished, replaced by an exclusive, low-key clientele. The air became heavier, quieter, and deeply controlled. It was no longer a club. It had become a private theater where only one man held the ticket to the main event. And every single night, from the absolute darkness of the elevated VIP booth, the silent watcher kept his vigil. Jace sat motionless behind the tinted glass, a crystal tumbler of untouched scotch pooling condensation against his palm. He wasn't looking at the ledger or reviewing the syndicate's shipping manifests. His entire universe had narrowed down to the circle of amber spotlight on the stage, where Zara stood at the microphone. She wore the same simple, unadorned black dress every night. It was her quiet rebellion, her way of telling him that his wealth could not dress her. But as she closed her eyes and let her raw, soulful voice bleed into the microphone, Jace found himself completely undone. He didn't just hear her music, he analyzed it with the precision of a man trying to decode a life-saving formula. He heard the fractures in her melody, the heavy defensive rhythm of her breathing, and the deep, echoing sorrow of a woman who had been pushed to the edge of the world and had to fight her way back alone. Jace had spent his entire life studying anomalies, and Zara was the most beautiful, dangerous anomaly he had ever encountered. He hadn't stopped at just watching her on stage. Within 48 hours of their icy confrontation in his office, a thick, black dossier had been placed on his desk by Min, his head of intelligence. Jace had memorized every line. He knew about the abusive ex-husband in the States, a man who had systematically stripped Zara of her financial security, her dignity, and her trust before abandoning her with nothing but a newborn baby and a broken spirit. Jace read the court documents, his jaw tightening until the bone ached, tracking the trajectory of how a brilliant, vibrant woman had been forced to turn her heart into a fortress of survival. But what fascinated Jace the most wasn't her past. It was her present. It was the child. From his vantage point in the shadows, Jace's gaze shifted from the stage to the small, dimly lit alcove near the backstage entrance. There, sitting on an overturned milk crate with a battered sketchbook, was 8-year-old Noah. The boy was a miniature reflection of his mother, holding the same defiant tilt of the chin, the same wide, guarded eyes that watched the world for incoming threats. Jace watched intently as Zara finished her final song. The applause rippled through the exclusive crowd, but Zara didn't bow. She stepped off the stage, her face instantly hardening back into its clinical defensive mask the moment the music stopped. She walked straight to Noah. Jace leaned forward, his dark eyes narrowing as he observed their interaction. Noah looked up, his face lighting up with a quiet hope as he reached his small hand out to grasp the hem of her black dress. It was a universal gesture, a child seeking comfort, a physical anchor from his mother. But Zara didn't take his hand. She stepped back, just an inch out of his reach. Her face didn't soften, Her eyes remained fixed on the exit. "Pack your pencils, Noah," Zara said, her voice carrying through the quiet backstage area, cold and mechanical. "The car is waiting. Move quickly. In this world, if you lag behind, nobody pauses to wait for you." Noah's hand dropped back to his side. He didn't cry. He didn't protest. He simply nodded, his little shoulders slumping slightly as he packed his sketchbook into a worn backpack. He had been conditioned to accept this distance. From the shadows of the VIP corridor, Jace felt a strange, physical ache pierce through his chest. A sensation so foreign it almost made him gasp. He had never been a father. His first marriage had been a cold, strategic arrangement of convenience that yielded no children and even less affection. He had believed himself entirely unsuited for parental warmth. Yet, looking at Noah's dejected silhouette and Zara's rigid, tense posture, Jace didn't see a liability. He saw a profound, devastating tragedy. Zara wasn't treating her son with coldness because she hated him. Jace realized it with absolute, shattering clarity. She was treating him with coldness because she was terrified. She believed that affection was a luxury they couldn't afford. She believed that if she allowed Noah to be soft, if she allowed him to lean on her, the world would crush him the same way his father had crushed her. She was raising a soldier, not a child, because she truly believed they were still in the middle of a war. "Chairman," Min's voice whispered from the darkness behind Jace. "The local syndicate factions are pushing back against the buyout of the club. They believe you are clearing the area for a turf expansion. It may become unsafe for the woman and the child to commute from the Incheon outskirts." Jace didn't break his gaze from the door where Zara and Noah had just exited. He slowly set his glass down on the marble ledge. The Iron Boss mask slid back over his face, but underneath it a new, terrifyingly protective instinct had taken root. "Double the unmarked security details along her transit route," Jace commanded, his voice dropping into an icy, lethal register. "If a single shadow crossed their path, eliminate it before she even notices the sky change." "And regarding the woman herself?" Min asked. "She still refuses all bonuses, all luxury transport, and all attempts at communication." Jace stood up, fastening the single button of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. He looked out over the empty stage, the scent of Zara's vanilla and spice perfume still faintly lingering in the air. "She thinks I am a predator trying to trap her in a cage," Jace murmured, a faint, bittersweet ghost of a smile touching his lips. "She expects me to use my power to force her submission, because that is what broken men do. She doesn't know that I have no interest in breaking her. I am going to rebuild the world around her until she realizes she doesn't need her armor anymore." He walked out of the booth, his footsteps silent on the plush carpet. He would wait. He would watch from the dark, analyzing every movement, every defense, and every vulnerability. He would be the ghost that protected them, the invisible wall between her fragile family and the harsh realities of Seoul. The battle for Zara's heart wasn't going to be won with billions or bullets, it was going to be a war of absolute patience. And Jace had all the time in the world to prove to her that his shadows were the only place where she and her son were truly safe. The air inside the Velvet Lounge's dressing room was suffocating. Usually the tiny space was Zara's temporary sanctuary after a performance, a place where she could lock the world out and count down the minutes until her shift officially ended. But tonight, the universe had rewritten the script. Noah sat on the small plush sofa in the corner, his small body shivering beneath his blue and green dinosaur pajamas. His breath came in shallow, ragged wheezes, his cheeks flushed a dangerous burning crimson. He had developed a sudden, terrifying fever midway through Zara's second set. Zara stood over him, her hands trembling as she pressed a damp, cold paper towel against his forehead. For all her fierce, independent armor, panic was beginning to claw its way up her throat. She reached for her phone to call a standard city taxi, her fingers slick with sweat. Incheon was an hour away, and public transit at 1 a.m. with a freezing, wheezing 8-year-old was a nightmare she couldn't afford to face. Suddenly, the heavy oak door of the dressing room swung open. Zara spun around, her body instinctively moving to shield Noah, her eyes flashing with her usual defensive fire. She expected a manager, or perhaps a security guard telling her to clear the room. Instead, Chairman Jace stepped across the threshold. He had shed his structured suit jacket, wearing only a pristine white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the powerful, lean muscles of his wrists. His presence immediately filled the small room, the sheer gravity of his authority anchoring the chaotic energy in the space. Behind him stood Min, holding an insulated medical case. "Get away from him," Zara snapped, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to sound lethal. She gripped the back of the sofa like a weapon. "I told you, Chairman. My life outside the stage is none of your business. We don't need your charity." Jace didn't step back. He didn't blink. He completely ignored her sharp tongue, his dark, calculating eyes locking directly onto Noah's labored breathing. "He is wheezing, Zara. His respiratory tract is constricting from a severe, febrile response," Jace said, his voice entirely devoid of its usual detached corporate tone. It was steady, calm, and absolute. "You can stay here and fight me out of pride, or you can let the best pediatric specialists in Seoul do their job. They are already waiting downstairs in my private transport." Zara froze, her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct she possessed told her that accepting help from a powerful man was a trap, a debt that would eventually be collected in blood or dignity. Her ex-husband had used kindness as a leash for years. She looked down at Noah, who let out a tiny, pitiful whimper, his small hand weakly reaching out into the air. "Fine," Zara whispered, the word tasting like ash on her tongue. "But I ride with him, and I pay for the medication. We will negotiate the bill later," Jace replied smoothly. The transition to the private medical wing of the Kang Syndicate's estate was a blur of seamless luxury. There were no crowded public waiting rooms, no clinical bureaucratic delays. Within 20 minutes of their arrival, Noah was settled into a massive, sterile yet comfortable private suite, an IV drip safely delivering fluids and fever reducers into his small arm. As the hours crawled past 3 a.m., the frantic terror slowly bled out of the room, replaced by a heavy, exhaustive silence. Noah's breathing finally stabilized, his eyes closing as a deep, healing sleep took over. Zara sat in a rigid armchair beside the bed, her long box braids casting shadows across her face. Her body was screaming for rest, but she refused to close her eyes. She couldn't. She was a soldier on guard duty. She looked toward the perimeter of the room and found Jace. He hadn't retreated to his luxurious master wing. He hadn't left her alone with the doctors. He was leaning against the far wall near the door, his arms crossed over his chest, his dark eyes quietly watching the steady rise and fall of Noah's chest. He looked tired. The flawless, untouchable Iron Boss looked human, a faint shadow of stubble darkening his razor-sharp jawline. Zara stood up slowly, her muscles aching, and walked over to him. She kept a deliberate 3 feet of distance between them. "Why are you still here, Jace?" she asked, her voice dropping to a raw, quiet whisper so she wouldn't wake the boy. "You've proven your power. You've shown me that your billions can buy health and speed. You can go back to your throne now." Jace uncrossed his arms. He stepped forward, closing the distance she had tried so hard to maintain, until he was standing directly in front of her. The subtle scent of his expensive cedarwood cologne mixed with the sterile air of the medical room. "You truly believe everything I do is a tactical demonstration, don't you?" Jace murmured, his voice a low, rough baritone that vibrated in the quiet room. "Men like you don't do anything without a return on investment," Zara countered, her chin tilting upward defiantly. "My ex-husband taught me that every gift from a wealthy man comes with an invoice." Jace looked at her for a long, silent moment. The cold, impenetrable mask he wore for the syndicate didn't just slip, it cracked completely open. For the first time, Zara saw the profound, heavy loneliness hiding behind his eyes. "Your ex-husband was a coward who used his wealth to diminish you because he was afraid of your strength," Jace said, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to reach out, though he kept his hands at his sides out of respect for her boundaries. "I do not want to buy you, Zara, and I do not want an invoice." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a soft, dark, gray cashmere blanket. Without a word, and with an agonizingly slow, careful movement, he reached out and gently draped it over Zara's cold, trembling shoulders. His knuckles brushed against the side of her neck for a fraction of a second. A touch that felt entirely electric, sending a wave of unfamiliar warmth rushing through her veins. Zara didn't pull away. She didn't throw the blanket on the floor. Her body went completely still, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up into his intense, fiercely protective gaze. "I stayed because you were shaking," Jace confessed, his voice dropping into a rough whisper. "And because, for the last 3 years, nobody has stood guard for you while you stood guard for him. Let me hold the door tonight, Zara. Just for tonight, you can put your armor back on tomorrow." Zara looked away, her eyes stinging with a sudden, overwhelming rush of unshed tears. She turned back toward the bed, clutching the heavy, warm cashmere tightly around herself. It was the first crack in her fortress. For the first time in 8 years, she wasn't entirely alone in the dark, and as she sat back down by her son's side, she realized with absolute terror that the Iron Boss was becoming the most dangerous thing to her survival, because he was making her want to feel again. The heavy black and cedar gates of the Kang estate closed with a muted, mechanical thud that signaled the end of the outside world. To Zara, the sound was an ominous reminder of her new reality. Following the incident at the club and a series of intercepted threats from Jace's underground rivals, the Iron Boss had made a calculated executive decision. The small, exposed apartment on the outskirts of Incheon was no longer viable. For their safety, Zara and Noah were to be housed within the heavily fortified perimeter of his private sanctuary. Zara stood in the center of the grand marble foyer, her hands buried deep in the pockets of a cozy, mustard-yellow sweater that acted as her comfort blanket against the sheer scale of the mansion. She looked up at the soaring ceilings and the winding grand staircase, with deep skepticism. She knew how the world worked. In her experience, when a powerful man built walls around you, it wasn't a sanctuary. It was a golden cage. "I don't belong here, Jace," Zara said, her voice echoing slightly against the polished stone floors. "And neither does my son. We are guests under duress, nothing more. I expect a lock on my door." Jace stood a few paces ahead of her. He had shed his structured suit jacket, wearing a simple charcoal cashmere turtleneck that contoured his athletic frame, softening his usually lethal silhouette. He turned to face her, his dark, penetrating eyes entirely calm. "The doors in this house only lock from the inside, Zara," Jace replied, his baritone voice grounding the vast space. "You are not a prisoner, nor are you a guest. My staff has been instructed to treat you as the mistress of this estate. Your word here is law. If my presence discomforts you, I will restrict myself to the West Wing entirely." Zara bit the inside of her cheek, searching his face for the hidden trap, the smug satisfaction of a man who had successfully cornered his prize. But she found nothing but a profound, unyielding respect. Over the next 2 weeks, Jace kept his word with meticulous old-school discipline. He did not hover, he did not demand her time, nor did he use his proximity to force interaction. Instead, he orchestrating a quiet, luxurious rhythm that slowly began to disarm her defenses. Every morning, a beautifully arranged breakfast featuring fresh ingredients and traditional American comfort food, a subtle nod to her roots, was placed in the sun-drenched morning room. When Zara requested a specific, rare blend of West African spices and fresh green herbs to cook her own meals, Jace didn't send a chef to do it for her. Later that evening, Zara walked into the massive, professional-grade kitchen, intending to prepare a simple stew. She stopped short at the entrance. Jace was already there. The multi-billionaire chairman of the Kang Syndicate was standing by the marble island, holding a heavy paper bag filled with the exact bright green cilantro, thyme and Scotch bonnet peppers she had requested. He was carefully laying them out, his large, capable hands handling the delicate herbs with surprising gentleness. "Min tracked them down from an international market near the docks," Jace said, not looking up immediately as he adjusted a bundle of scallions. "I wanted to ensure the quality met your standards before the staff prepped them." Zara leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her mustard sweater. "You're a busy man, Chairman. Don't you have a syndicate to run? Or a boardroom to terrify? Why are you playing grocer in your own kitchen?" Jace finally looked up, his intense gaze locking onto hers. The amber overhead lighting caught the sharp angle of his jawline, throwing his handsome features into high contrast. "A boardroom is predictable, Zara. It runs on greed and fear. This, ensuring that you and Noah feel a sense of home here. This is the only task that has mattered to me in weeks." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the cutting boards. Instead of taking over or forcing a conversation, he simply picked up a knife and began chopping onions with practiced efficiency, slipping naturally into the role of her assistant. He didn't crowd her space. He respected the boundary of her shadow, letting her dictate the pace of the evening. It was an agonizingly slow, beautiful torture for Zara. She had built a fortress around her heart, expecting a siege of power, money, and aggression, the weapons her ex-husband had used to break her spirit. But Jace wasn't attacking her fortress. He was simply standing outside it in the cold, offering warmth, patience, and absolute devotion. Later that night, after Noah had been tucked into his massive plush bed in the adjoining suite, Zara walked out onto the private balcony overlooking the manicured gardens. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain. She heard the soft, rhythmic sound of footsteps before she saw him. Jace stepped onto the balcony, keeping a deliberate 3 feet of distance between them as he leaned his forearms against the stone balustrade, looking out at the darkened tree line. "He is sleeping well," Jace murmured softly. "The pediatricians confirm the fever has completely cleared his system. He feels safe here." "He likes the library," Zara admitted, her voice dropping its usual sharp edge, softened by the quiet of the night. "He told me the house feels like a castle. I told him not to get used to it." Jace turned his head slightly, his dark eyes tracing the elegant lines of her silhouette, the way her long box braids caught the silver moonlight. "Why must you always prepare him for the departure, Zara? Is it so terrifying to consider staying? When you've lived in the dark as long as I have, Jace, a bright light doesn't look like a savior," Zara whispered, her voice cracking with a rare, raw vulnerability. "It looks like a spotlight that makes it easier for the enemy to hit you. I can't let my guard down. If I get soft, if I let Noah think the world is this kind, he won't survive the day we have to leave." Jace didn't argue. He didn't offer empty platitudes or generic promises of protection. Instead, he shifted closer, his movements slow and entirely telegraphed. He reached out, his large warm hand hovering over hers where it rested on the cold stone balustrade. He waited, giving her the space to pull away. Zara looked down at his hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't move. Slowly, Jace lowered his hand, his long fingers gently sliding over hers, enveloping her smaller hand in a steady, protective warmth. The contrast of his smooth, warm skin against her chilled fingers sent a powerful, grounding shockwave through her entire body. "Then let me be the spotlight, Zara," Jace whispered, his voice deep and fiercely resolute in the quiet night. "Let them aim at me. Your only job in this house is to learn how to breathe again. I will handle the rest." Zara didn't pull her hand back. For the first time in 8 years, she allowed herself to lean, just a fraction of an inch, into the strength of a man who refused to let her fall. The golden cage was still standing, but the bars were beginning to feel less like a prison and more like a shield. The rain had been falling over Seoul for 3 straight days, casting a gray, meditative mist over the Kang estate. Inside, the mansion was unusually quiet. Chairman Jace had cancelled his morning briefings with the syndicate leaders, a move that sent shockwaves through his corporate offices. But here, within the reinforced walls of his sanctuary, the Iron Boss was entirely unreachable. Zara walked down the long wood-paneled corridor of the West Wing, her soft slippers making no sound against the Persian runners. She was wearing a simple, comfortable cream-colored knit dress, her long box braids pulled back into a loose, low ponytail. In her hands, she carried a small ceramic mug of herbal tea. She was looking for Noah. Usually, by this time of the afternoon, he would be in the conservatory sketching, but his usual spots were empty. As she approached the entrance of the Grand Library, a massive, 2-story room filled with thousands of leather-bound volumes and smelling of old paper and beeswax, she heard a sound that made her stop dead, in her tracks. It was a laugh, a genuine, bright, unburdened laugh. It belonged to Noah. Zara's heart skipped a beat. Noah rarely laughed like that. Her strict, defensive upbringing had made him a quiet, somber child who mirrored her own constant state of alertness. She stepped closer to the heavy, half-open oak doors, peeking through the vertical sliver of space. The scene inside completely shattered every preconception she had ever held about the cold, ruthless chairman of the Kang Syndicate. A massive, ornate hand-carved mahogany chess table sat in the center of the room's bay window, framed by the falling rain outside. Sitting on the plush velvet chair was 8-year-old Noah, leaning forward so intensely his chest was nearly pressing against the wood. And sitting directly across from him, completely discarding his corporate armor, was Jace. The billionaire sat on a low wooden stool, bringing himself down to Noah's eye level. He had rolled up the sleeves of his black linen shirt, his powerful tattooed forearms resting casually on the edge of the table. The terrifying Iron Boss looked entirely at peace. "You're rushing, Noah," Jace said, his deep baritone voice carrying a gentle, patient warmth that Zara had never heard him use in the boardroom or the club. "Look at the entire board. Your night is safe. But what happens to your castle if you move too quickly?" Noah twisted his mouth, his brow furrowing as he studied the hand-carved obsidian and ivory pieces. "If I move the night, your bishop takes my castle." "Exactly," Jace smiled, a genuine rare expression that softened the sharp, lethal angles of his jawline. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently ruffling Noah's hair. "In chess, and in life, the enemy wants you to focus on the small trap so you miss the grand strategy. Protect your foundation first. Slow down." Zara stood frozen in the hallway, the ceramic mug growing cold in her hands. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, hot and sudden. She watched as Jace patiently demonstrated the defensive maneuvers, speaking to Noah not like a dynamic corporate executive lecturing a subordinate, but like a father guiding his son. He didn't raise his voice when Noah made a mistake. He simply reset the pieces and explained the physics of the game with an encouraging, protective devotion. It was a kind of love that Zara had never been able to give her son. She had been so consumed by survival, so strangled by the fear of her toxic ex-husband returning to break them completely, that she had starved Noah of softness. She had taught him how to hide, how to be tough, and how to stand alone. She had never taught him how to play. As she watched Jace reset the board, Noah looked up at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated admiration. The exact look a boy gives the man he wants to become. Zara took a step backward, intending to slip away into the shadows to process the overwhelming wave of emotion crashing through her chest, but her slipper caught the edge of the hallway runner. The heavy oak door creaked slightly as she stumbled. Jace's head snapped toward the doorway instantly, his lethal mafia instincts returning for a fraction of a second before his eyes landed on Zara. His expression immediately softened into something deeply tender. "Zara," Jace said, standing up from the low stool. Noah spun around in his chair, his face bright with excitement. "Mom, look, Chairman Jace is teaching me the Sicilian defense. He says I'm an analytical thinker, just like you." Zara forced a small, trembling smile onto her face, stepping into the room. She placed her mug on a nearby side table, her arms instinctively crossing over her knit dress as she tried to reassemble her crumbling armor. "I see that," Zara said, her voice thick with unshed emotion. She looked at Noah, her eyes searching his face. "Noah, go up to the kitchen and ask the chef for some sliced apples, okay? Give me a few minutes to speak with the chairman." Noah looked between the two of them, sensing the heavy adult energy in the room. He nodded quickly, patted Jace on the hip in a surprisingly familiar gesture, and hurried out of the library, leaving the heavy doors to swing shut behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jace stood by the chess table, his dark eyes tracking the micro-expressions of heartbreak and vulnerability flashing across Zara's beautiful face. "If my interaction with him displeased you, Zara, I apologize," Jace said softly, taking a cautious step toward her, respecting her boundary. He was wandering the halls, looking lonely. "I only intended to occupy his time." "He wasn't lonely, Jace. He was being a kid," Zara whispered, a single tear finally breaking free and escaping down her cheek. She looked up at him, her defenses completely shattered. "I haven't let him be a kid in 3 years. Zara, no. Listen to me," she interrupted, her voice cracking as she stepped closer to him, her hands trembling. "I have spent every single day of his life telling him that softness is a liability. I taught him to be cold because I thought the world would destroy him if he wasn't. And then I walk in here, and I see you, a man who actually commands a world of blood and shadows, treating him with the kind of patience and tenderness I was always too terrified to give him." Jace closed the remaining distance between them, his powerful frame towering over her, but his presence was entirely grounding. He reached up, his large warm hands hovering for a fraction of a second before he gently cupped her face, his thumbs wiping the tears from her skin. "You did what you had to do to keep him alive, Zara," Jace murmured fiercely, his dark eyes burning with an intense, protective love. "You were fighting a war by yourself. But the war is over now. You don't have to be his shield anymore. I am the shield now. Let me teach him how to be strong, and you can just teach him how to be loved." Zara let out a ragged, broken sob, her forehead dropping against Jace's broad chest. She didn't pull away. She didn't fight him. For the first time in her entire life, the guarded single mother surrendered to the safety of a man who refused to let her break. The midpoint had been reached. The Iron Boss hadn't just opened the cage. He had become her home. The shift in the Kang estate was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet, molecular change. The frost that had blanketed Zara's life for nearly a decade was melting under the unyielding, patient heat of Chairman Jace's devotion. It was a slow burn, a romance built not on grand, empty gestures, but on the quiet accumulation of safety. For a woman who had learned to view every kindness as a hidden trap, Jace's consistency was the ultimate aphrodisiac. It manifested in the small, domestic moments that felt entirely surreal inside the grand mansion. On a Tuesday afternoon, the expansive professional kitchen smelled of rich, roasted bell peppers, garlic, and the sharp, bright tang of the fresh green herbs Jace had sourced for her. Zara stood at the massive marble island, a light dusting of white flour on the tip of her nose, her long box braids securely pinned back. She was preparing a traditional, slow-simmered savory sauce, a recipe passed down from her grandmother. Jace walked in, discarding his heavy wool overcoat and loosening his dark silk tie. He didn't head for his private office to review the syndicate's quarterly numbers. Instead, he rolled his sleeves up past his forearms, exposing the intricate dark ink of his tattoos, and stepped directly into her space. He didn't crowd her. He simply picked up a wooden spoon and stood by the simmering pot, checking the heat. As Zara reached across the island for a bowl of chopped red peppers, her hand brushed against his. Zara froze, her breath hitching in her throat. A year ago, a sudden touch from a man would have triggered an internal alarm, a visceral need to step back and reassemble her armor. But now, as his warm, smooth skin grazed hers, a powerful grounding wave of heat rushed up her arm. She looked up, meeting his gaze. Jace was already looking down at her, his intense dark eyes carrying a softness reserved exclusively for this room. Seeing the smudge of white flour on her nose, the terrifying Iron Boss let out a low, private chuckle. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping the flour from her skin with agonizing slowness. "You're distracted, Zara," Jace murmured, his deep baritone voice vibrating in the warm air of the kitchen. "I'm not distracted," Zara countered, a soft, rare smile tugging at the corners of her lips as she leaned slightly into his touch. "I'm just adjusting to the fact that a multi-billionaire is currently acting as my sous chef." "I am whatever you need me to be," Jace replied, his tone shifting into something fiercely serious, his thumb lingering on her cheekbone. "If you need an assistant, I am here. If you need a shield, I am standing in front of you. Loving you has given me a purpose that a boardroom never could." Zara's heart hammered against her ribs, not out of fear but from the sheer weight of his sincerity. Loving Jace had changed her, but seeing the way it had transformed him was breathtaking. The icy, unapproachable chairman who used to rule his empire with fear had developed a soul. His men noticed it, the syndicate boardroom felt the change. He was still entirely lethal to his enemies, but he no longer lived in the gray. He had found his light. The slow burn reached its peak later that week, deep in the quiet hours of a rainy Friday night. Noah was fast asleep in his bedroom, exhausted from a long day of playing soccer on the lawn with Jace. Zara stepped out of the master bathroom, wrapped in a soft, flowing lilac silk robe that Jace had left for her. Her braids hung loosely over her shoulders, and her skin felt warm from a long, hot bath. She walked into the dim library, where a fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long, amber shadows across the leather-bound books. Jace was sitting on the leather sofa, a glass of dark amber whiskey in his hand, staring into the flames. He looked up as she entered, his breath catching visibly as his eyes traced the elegant, serene lines of her silhouette. The defensive, hyper-vigilant woman who had marched into his office weeks ago was gone, replaced by a queen who finally knew she was safe in her own palace. Zara walked over to him, her movements fluid and entirely unhurried. She didn't sit across from him. She sat directly beside him, tucking her legs beneath her silk robe. Jace set his glass down on the side table, turning his entire body to face her. He didn't rush. He respected the delicate chemistry of her trust, giving her the space to set the boundaries. Slowly, Zara reached out, her fingers gently tracing the sharp, masculine line of his jaw, feeling the slight roughness of his afternoon stubble. Jace closed his eyes, leaning his face into her palm, letting out a heavy, contented sigh that sounded like a man who had finally come home after a lifetime of war. "I used to think that survival meant being completely untouchable," Zara whispered, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the crackling fire. "I thought that if I let someone in, they would use my heart as leverage to destroy me. But you didn't try to break my walls down, Jace. You just stood outside in the cold until I was ready to open the door." Jace opened his eyes, his dark gaze burning with an unyielding protective fire. He reached out, taking her hand in his. His large, scarred fingers enveloped hers completely, grounding her in his strength. Slowly, deliberately, Jace brought her hand up to his lips. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss against her knuckles, his breath warm against her skin. It wasn't a claim of ownership, it was a vow of absolute reverence. "Your walls kept you and Noah alive, Zara," Jace murmured against her skin, looking up at her through his dark lashes. "I never wanted to destroy them. I just wanted to build an entire empire around them so you'd never have to fight alone again. You are the only real thing in my world." He shifted closer, his hand moving to the back of her neck, his fingers gently tangling in her braids as he drew her in. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't the frantic, chaotic explosion of a new obsession. It was a slow, deep and deeply emotional surrender. The kiss tasted of vanilla, cedarwood and a fierce, unyielding truth. As the rain patted against the high windows of the library, Zara let go of the last remnants of her past. She allowed herself to melt completely into his embrace, her hands gripping the fabric of his linen shirt. The Iron Boss and the guarded single mother had successfully written a new law for their empire, and it was written entirely in the language of a love that refused to be bought. The domestic peace that had settled over the Kang estate vanished on a Tuesday morning, replaced by the suffocating, familiar stench of a past Zara thought she had left thousands of miles behind. The rain had ceased, leaving the air thick, humid and charged with tension. Zara was standing in the sun-drenched conservatory, a pair of shears in her hand as she trimmed fresh green herbs for dinner. Noah was a few yards away, sitting at his small wooden easel, humming happily as he painted a picture of the estate's golden retriever puppy. For the first time in his life, his brushstrokes were loose, vibrant, and free, a direct reflection of the security Jace had given him. The glass doors of the conservatory burst open with a violent, echoing slam. Zara's body instantly went rigid, her maternal defenses snapping back into place before she even saw the intruder. She dropped the shears, stepping swiftly in front of Noah's easel, shielding her son with her own body. It wasn't Jace. It wasn't Min. Standing in the doorway, flanked by two rogue guards wearing the uniforms of a rival Seoul syndicate, was Marcus, her ex-husband. He looked exactly as he had the day he ruined her life in the States, handsome in a sharp, superficial way, wearing an expensive designer suit that couldn't hide the rot in his soul. He had a smug, predatory grin plastered across his face. "Well, look at this," Marcus drawled, his voice a sharp, toxic weapon that sent a wave of icy terror rushing through Zara's veins. From a broken-down apartment in Incheon to a literal palace in Seoul. "You always did have an eye for luxury, Zara. You just needed a bigger sucker to pay for it." "Marcus," Zara whispered, her hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists inside the pockets of her dark trench coat. She could feel Noah trembling behind her, his small fingers gripping the fabric of her coat. "How did you get in here? This estate is locked down. Locked down to outsiders, maybe." Marcus laughed, taking a slow, menacing step into the conservatory. "But your new boyfriend has enemies, Zara. A rival family called the Choi Syndicate was more than happy to pay for my flight and hand me a security badge. They wanted leverage on the great Iron Boss. Imagine their surprise when I told them I could hand them his biggest vulnerability on a silver platter." Marcus's eyes shifted past Zara, landing directly on Noah. The predatory grin widened. "The boy belongs to me legally, Zara. You fled the country. You stole my asset. The Choi family is going to help me take him back. Unless, of course, Chairman Jace wants to transfer 40% of his shipping docks to keep his new little family intact." The world tilted on its axis. The great betrayal wasn't just Marcus's sudden appearance. It was the shattering realization that her love for Jace had painted a massive glowing target on her son's back. The very softness she had allowed herself to feel over the past few weeks had made them weak. She had lowered her guard, and the monster had walked right through the gap. "Don't you dare look at him," Zara spat, her voice dropping into a low, lethal register that surprised even Marcus. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a mother willing to tear the world apart. "You abandoned him. You beat us down until we had nothing. You will not touch him." "I don't need to touch him here," Marcus sneered, snapping his fingers. The two rogue guards stepped forward, their hands resting on the hilts of their concealed weapons. "The Choi Mun are already at his school gates, and they have the transport ready. We're taking the boy Zara. Jace can negotiate the ransom with the Choi chairman tonight." Before the guards could advance another step, Noah let out a sharp, terrified cry, dropping his paintbrush. The sound broke something fundamental inside Zara. The old panic, the suffocating, paralyzing fear that had defined her 20s, flashed through her mind, screaming that she had to run, that she had to hide, that she had to protect her child by reverting back to the cold, isolated soldier she used to be. "Noah, run," Zara shouted, turning and shoving the boy toward the side exit of the conservatory that led into the dense forest path of the estate. Marcus lunged forward to grab her, but Zara didn't hesitate. She picked up a heavy ceramic flower pot from the shelf and hurled it directly at his chest, the clay shattering with a loud crack. Marcus stumbled back, cursing violently as dirt and water soaked his expensive suit. Zara didn't wait to see him recover. She turned on her heel and ran out into the dark, rainy night that was beginning to settle over the forest path, chasing after Noah's retreating silhouette. Her long box braids whipped around her face in the rising wind. Her heart was shattering into a million pieces. As she sprinted through the muddy path, her mind was a chaotic, agonizing loop of self-blame. "I got soft," she thought, tears of anger and terror streaming down her face. "I let myself believe a mafia boss could keep us safe. I brought this danger to my son." She reached the edge of the estate's perimeter wall, where a small iron maintenance gate stood slightly ajar, likely left open by the traders who had escorted Marcus inside. She caught up to Noah, who was sobbing, his blue and green dinosaur pajamas stained with mud. "Mom, where's Jace? Why isn't Jace stopping them?" Noah cried, looking back toward the mansion. "Jace can't help us, Noah," Zara whispered, her voice breaking as she grabbed his small hand, pulling him through the iron gate and out into the desolate, industrial road that bordered the property. She looked back at the grand golden lights of the mansion, her chest heaving with a deep defensive rage. "We are on our own. We have always been on our own." She pulled her phone from her pocket, intending to call a private transit line, but before she could dial, the blinding high beams of a black van illuminated the dark road, pinning them in a spotlight. The engine roared, tires screeching against the wet asphalt as it pulled up to the curb, blocking their escape. Zara stood in the downpour, her body completely shielding Noah as the side doors of the van slid open. It wasn't Jace's security detail. The men stepping out wore the crimson armbands of the Choi Syndicate. She had run straight out of the golden cage, and right into the jaws of the dragon. The atmospheric shift inside the Kang estate was suffocating. Following the chaotic ambush near the perimeter wall, where Jace's loyal sentries had arrived just in time to neutralize the Choi Syndicate's van in a flurry of silent lethal precision, the danger had been suppressed. Marcus and his local traders were captured and dragged into the deep underbelly of the compound. Noah was safe, physically unharmed and sleeping under a double guard in the reinforced nursery. But the emotional damage was done. A cold, agonizing war had begun within the mansion walls. Zara had retreated entirely behind her fortress. She locked herself in the master suite of the West Wing, refusing to eat the meals sent by the kitchen, refusing to look at the luxury that surrounded her. She had reverted completely to the hyper-vigilant, icy soldier she used to be. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Marcus's smug face and heard Noah's terrified cries. She blamed her own vulnerability. She had allowed herself to taste happiness, and the universe had immediately punished her for it. In the East Wing, the Iron Boss had returned with a vengeance that terrified his own syndicate. Jace didn't sleep. He spent his nights in his glass-walled office, his expression a mask of absolute, frozen fury. He had launched a brutal, systematic legal and financial dismantling of the Choi family's assets, freezing their offshore accounts and exposing their corporate fronts to the international authorities. He didn't use street violence. He used his overwhelming power to erase them from Seoul's ecosystem entirely. He did it all to secure Zara's world, but he did it from a distance. He didn't force his way into her locked suite. He knew that if he used his authority to compel her to speak to him, he would prove her worst fears right, that he was just another man trying to manage and control her life. On the 5th night of this silent standoff, the oppressive quiet was broken. Zara sat on the edge of the plush king-sized bed, wearing a rigid dark charcoal sweater, her arms crossed over her chest. Her long box braids hung like heavy ropes around her pale face. She was staring at the door when a soft, respectful knock echoed through the room. It wasn't Jace. It was Min, the head of security. Zara opened the door slowly, her eyes guarded. Min stood in the hallway looking deeply exhausted. He held a weathered vintage leather binder in his hands. "The chairman did not send me, Miss Zara," Min said, his voice low and solemn. "In fact, he ordered me to leave you in peace. But I have served Jace for over a decade, and I have never seen him like this. He is destroying his enemies, but he is starving himself to death in the process. He hasn't left his desk in 96 hours. Min held out the leather binder. "He wanted you to have this. It's the original deed and the legal restoration papers for your family's old estate in the States. The property your ex-husband stole and liquidated through fraud." Zara's breath caught in her throat. She slowly reached out, her fingers trembling as she took the binder. "Jace didn't just capture Marcus," Min explained softly. "He forced him to sign over every legal right he possessed. Marcus is currently inside a federal holding cell, facing life charges for international fraud, extortion, and child endangerment. He can never touch you or Noah again. Jace used the entire weight of the Kang Syndicate to legally anchor your freedom. He didn't want the credit. He just wanted to ensure that if you choose to leave this house, you leave with your dignity and your history fully restored." After Min bowed and walked away, Zara closed the heavy oak door. She sat back down on the bed, her hands shaking as she opened the binder. Inside lay the pristine official certificates bearing her family name, completely cleared of any debt or legal stains. At the very back of the file, on a heavy sheet of cream paper, was a single sentence written in Jace's sharp, elegant calligraphy. "The armor you wear was built to protect you from cowards, Zara. I never wanted you to take it off for me. I just wanted to build a world where you'd never have to wear it again." A hot, heavy tear spilled over Zara's lashes, splashing onto the ink. The cold war in her chest began to shatter. She realized that while she had been hiding from his power, fearing it would trap her, Jace had been using that exact power to heal the deepest wounds of her past. He hadn't managed her. He hadn't caged her. He had championed her. She looked toward the adjoining room, where Noah was sleeping soundly, guarded by men who would gladly take a bullet for him. She thought about the Iron Dragon sitting alone in his dark glass office, starving in a palace of plenty, refusing to push himself into her space out of sheer respect for her boundaries. Pride was a lonely shelter, and Zara was suddenly deeply tired of freezing inside it. She stood up, her jaw tightening with a new, fierce determination. She didn't call him on the house phone. She walked out of the West Wing, her dark trench coat flowing behind her as she marched down the long, silent corridors toward his private office. It was time for the silent war to end. The heavy glass doors of the East Wing office slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The room was dark, illuminated only by the cold, ambient blue glow of the Seoul skyline bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The air felt heavy, smelling faintly of rich cedarwood and stale espresso. Chairman Jace sat behind his massive minimalist desk. His tie was completely gone, the top 3 buttons of his black dress shirt undone to reveal the dark, intricate ink trailing up his throat. He looked absolutely exhausted. A faint shadow of stubble roughened his usually razor-sharp jawline, and his dark eyes were bloodshot, staring fixedly at a glowing tablet displaying the final asset liquidation of the Choi Syndicate. The terrifying Iron Boss looked like a king sitting on a throne of ash. He didn't look up when the doors opened. He assumed it was Min bringing another security briefing. "I told you to leave the files on the console, Min," Jace said, his baritone voice rough, raspy, and deeply hollow from days of silence. I'm not signing anything else tonight. Good. Because you've signed enough. Jace's head snapped up instantly. The cold, mechanical focus in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden, raw shock. Zara stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing her defensive trench coat or her heavy armor. She wore a simple, soft cream-colored knit dress, her long box braids falling loose over her shoulders. In her hands, she clutched the weathered leather binder Min had given her. Her beautiful, dark-skinned face was wet with silent, streaming tears. Jace stood up so fast his leather chair rolled back against the glass wall. His hands instinctively twitched, wanting to reach out to her, but he caught himself. He stopped on his side of the desk, his powerful frame rigid as he forced himself to respect the 3 feet of space between them. Zara, Jace murmured, his voice cracking with an agonizing tenderness. What's wrong? Is Noah all right? If the guards outside your door are making you feel uneasy, I will reassign them immediately. Noah is asleep, Jace. Zara interrupted, her voice trembling as she walked past the desk, closing the distance between them until she was standing directly in front of him. She looked up into his tired, bloodshot eyes, her chest heaving with a deep, breathless emotion. Noah is perfectly safe. Because of you. Jace looked down at the leather binder in her hands, a bittersweet, heavy expression softening his features. Min shouldn't have given you that yet. I wanted to ensure the American authorities had processed the titles fully before you saw them. I wanted you to know, you have your home back, Zara. You have your freedom. You don't ever have to stay in this city, or near my shadows out of obligation. Zara let out a ragged, broken laugh that sounded more like a sob. She threw the binder onto the desk behind him, the heavy leather landing with a dull thud. You brilliant, terrifying, stupid man, Zara whispered, her voice breaking completely as she reached up, her hands trembling violently as she pressed her palms against his stubble-roughened cheeks. Jace went entirely breathless. His body froze, his hands hovering at his sides, completely paralyzed by the sudden electric warmth of her touch. I have spent 8 years running Jace, Zara sobbed, the tears flowing freely down her face now. 8 years locking my heart in a vault because I thought that if I let down my guard for even a second, the dark would find us and destroy my son. When Marcus walked into that conservatory, my first instinct was to freeze. I blamed myself for getting soft. I blamed you for making me think we could have a normal life. She stepped closer, her body pressing against his chest, feeling the frantic, heavy thudding of his heart beneath his black shirt. But then I opened that file, Zara said, looking up into his burning, intense gaze. And I realized something. Marcus didn't break through your walls because we were soft. He broke through because he was a parasite. And you didn't use your power to cage me, Jace. You used your entire empire to hunt down my monsters and tear them to pieces. You didn't give me a golden cage. You gave me a shield. Zara let out a ragged sob, her forehead dropping against his broad chest. I have been so cold to my boy Jace. I was so afraid of making him weak that I forgot to show him how to be happy. I spent years withholding the love he deserved, because I was fighting a war by myself. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I stayed away. The last remnants of Jace's icy corporate control shattered completely. With a low, feral groan of pure surrender, his large arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his body with a desperate, crushing intensity. He buried his face into the crook of her neck, his fingers tangling tightly in her long box braids, as he held her like a drowning man clutching a lifeline. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his chest heaving against hers as he allowed his own unshed tears to wet her shoulder. You have nothing to apologize for, Zara, Jace murmured fiercely against her skin, his voice rough with an intense, protective love. You kept him alive in a world that wanted to break you. You did enough. You fought long enough. He lifted his head slowly, his large, warm hands moving to cup her face, his thumbs gently wiping the tears from her dark skin with a reverence that felt like a sacred vow. He looked down at her, his eyes burning with an absolute, unyielding truth. I told you before, and I will say it every day for the rest of our lives. Jace whispered, his forehead resting gently against hers. The war is over, Zara. The monsters are gone. You don't have to be the shield anymore. I am the shield now. You can just be his mother. And you can let me love you. Zara looked up at him through her wet lashes, her heart feeling lighter, warmer, and more profound than it ever had in her entire life. The Iron Boss had successfully dismantled his own dark syndicate, just to build a sanctuary for her spirit. Then show me, Zara whispered. Show me how to stop fighting. When Jace leaned down and pressed his lips to hers, it wasn't a slow burn anymore. It was a beautiful, chaotic explosion of healing and absolute devotion. The kiss tasted of tears, rain, and a fierce, unshakable promise. As the lights of Seoul glittered outside the massive glass windows, the single mother and the Mafia King stood completely united in the dark, no longer protectors and victims, but a husband and a wife, building a future out of hope. 1 year later, the gray, suffocating mist that once hung over the Kang estate was completely gone, replaced by the brilliant golden light of a late spring afternoon. The birds chirped happily in the manicured gardens, and the heavy iron gates no longer felt like the bars of a fortress, but like the grand entryway to a peaceful kingdom. Inside the massive sun-drenched kitchen, the air was rich with the familiar mouth-watering aroma of slow-simmered savory stews and fresh green herbs. Zara stood by the marble island, her expression completely transformed. The cold, hyper-vigilant mask she had worn for a decade had dissolved entirely, replaced by a radiant, serene warmth. She wore a soft, flowing emerald-green sundress that beautifully complemented her rich, dark skin, and her long box braids were swept up into a beautiful, elegant crown. She wasn't looking at the stovetop, though. Her gaze was fixed out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the expansive back lawn. Out on the grass, a bright white soccer ball was being kicked back and forth. 8-year-old Noah was sprinting across the lawn, his laughter echoing loudly through the afternoon air. He looked entirely different now. His shoulders were loose, his movements free, and his face was bright with the unburdened joy of a child who knew he was fiercely protected. Chasing right behind him, with his sleeves rolled up and a genuine booming laugh escaping his chest, was Jace. The terrifying Iron Boss of Seoul was currently down on one knee, dramatically missing a tackle just to let Noah score a goal past the estate's golden retriever puppy. Watching them, Zara felt a profound, overwhelming wave of emotion swell in her chest. She remembered the cold library a year ago, where she had first seen Jace thaw her son's guarded heart. Now, that tenderness was their everyday reality. Noah kicked the ball into the makeshift net and let out a victorious shout. I did it. Mom, did you see that? I beat the boss. Noah turned and sprinted toward the open terrace doors, his small sneakers pounding against the stone. For the first time in his life, he didn't hesitate. He didn't reach out with a timid, uncertain hand. He lunged straight into the kitchen and threw his arms completely around Zara's waist. And this time, Zara didn't pull away. She didn't tell him to stand alone. With a soft, fiercely emotional sigh, Zara dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms tightly around her son, burying her face into his shoulder as she pulled him into a massive, protective, and deeply loving hug. She pressed a dozen warm kisses against his forehead, holding him with the absolute freedom of a mother who was no longer afraid to love. I saw it, baby, Zara whispered, her voice thick with happy tears as she ruffled his hair. You're getting too fast for him. Jace walked into the kitchen a moment later, breathing heavily, a warm, incredibly handsome smile lighting up his sharp features. He didn't look like a man who ruled an underworld empire. He looked like a man who had found his heaven. He stepped up behind Zara, his large, capable hands settling gently on her shoulders, drawing both her and Noah into his powerful, grounding embrace. Zara leaned back against his solid chest, her hand reaching up to clasp his fingers. They stood there together, framed by the sunlight, a family forged not out of convenience, but out of survival, patience, and an unbreakable devotion. Slowly, Zara turned her head, looking directly past the marble island, her brilliant dark eyes locking onto the lens with absolute, fierce certainty. I spent years believing that keeping my heart cold was the only way to protect my son from the dark, Zara said, her voice a beautiful resonant melody of pure triumph. I thought that softness was a luxury we couldn't afford. But Jace taught me that the only way to truly fight the shadows is to let the light in. Together, we didn't just build an empire, we built a home. And in Annie's empire, love isn't just a vulnerability. It is the fiercest weapon we have. Jace leaned down, pressing